The trade war between the world's two largest economies reaches far beyond their borders. We'll discuss how the US-China trade dispute is impacting developing countries, from Africa to Latin America. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. There appears to be no end in sight to the US-China trade war. Since July, Washington and Beijing have levied 25% tariffs on each other's goods, worth $34 billion. And in 2 weeks, each country will target another $16 billion in goods. US President Donald Trump is readying 25% tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. And China says it will respond with additional tariffs on $60 billion in US goods. The US tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from Canada, Mexico, and the European Union are also causing ripple effects around the world. South Africa says nearly 8,000 jobs in the steel and aluminium industry are now at risk, and its currency, the rand, continues to lose value. For more on the global implications of the US-China trade war, let's bring in our panel. Here in the studio is Arthur Dong. He's the professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Also with us, Robert Moran. He's a partner with Brunswick Insight, a consulting firm on global opinions and market research. From Johannesburg, we're joined by Biniza. He's a political economist and the finance and operations director at Political Economy Southern Africa. And Manuel Suarez-Mier is a Latin America economic consultant and former chief Latin American economist for Bank of America. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Arthur, let's start right here in the studio with you. So this tariff dispute between the United States and China is escalating. The latest we hear is that the US has announced more tariffs, $16 billion worth of Chinese goods. China, for its part, says it will impose counter tariffs. Now, we've heard about the effect that these tariffs are having on these two countries, the United States and China. But what about the rest of the world? Will there be collateral damage here?
Oh, without a doubt. As we see these tariffs start to take effect, there will be secondary and tertiary impacts around the world. As we all know, China is a nation that not only does a lot of manufacturing, but many of the inputs that go into the China manufacturing base are sourced from other countries all over the world. So therefore, a slowdown in the manufacturing possibilities for China will also mean that other nations will, in a sense, also feel the impact and catch a cold as a result.
Let's go to Johannesburg. Sia, as we just heard from Arthur, manufacturing is now a very complex process. We have complex supply chains all over. If we look at a country like South Africa and look at its automobile industry, for instance, South Africa exports key auto components to the United States. What will tariffs do to South Africa's competitiveness?
All right, so they've already estimated that at least 7,000 jobs will be affected by the tariff increase. Mainly our automotive exports, as you mentioned, catalytic converters being the most affected. But also our other manufacturing exports, such as household goods, manufactured such as microwaves, washing machines, etc., are also going to be affected by this, the tariff increase. And the worst is that we made a lot of compromises to secure our position in AGOA, which was supposed to give us special access to the US market. But obviously with these tariffs, this undermines this. And at the same time, it undermines some of the bargains and the trade-offs that we have had to make as a country in order to secure access to the US market.
So how does a country like South Africa safeguard its interests? Do you now start looking at other markets?
Definitely. I think this will definitely push the South African manufacturers or exporters at least to look at least towards Eastern markets. Obviously, the traditional markets in terms of the EU still remain open, but more increasingly, especially with the signing of the Africa Free Trade Area Agreement, the African market seems to be a viable option, particularly for South African exporters. But it's a very difficult road to walk, definitely because it's very difficult to integrate some of the local suppliers when expanding the value chain into the rest of the continent, which is critical to ensure that the process of intra-African trade is mutually beneficial. So yes, with the tariffs in the US, the South African exporters will be looking towards Eastern markets, the traditional EU markets, as well as the African markets.
Manuel, we hear about how these tariffs could hurt developing countries, the negative impact of these tariffs. But I'm wondering, could some countries actually emerge as winners? Let's take Brazil as an example in Latin America. Brazil is a supplier, is a producer of soybeans, for instance. Could it take the place of those exports from the United States to, say, China?
Sure. To the extent that you have trade diversion, as it's called technically, trade that is being diverted from the U.S. To Brazil or Argentina, which are prime producers of raw materials and particularly grains and that sort of thing, you can expect that those countries will benefit to the detriment of the U.S. But the losses are much greater than the wins. The overall balance of cost-benefit analysis of trade wars is negative in the general spectrum. Now, there is a major difference between particularly Mexico and the rest of Latin America. Mexico is competing with China in the US market. So we are more competitive rather than complementary, which is the case of Brazil and Argentina. In our case, in the case of Mexico, it's going to be far more difficult to diversify and to increase our exports to China to compensate for the exports that will no longer be going to the US.
You talk about the losses for Brazil. What are the broad losses for Brazil in a dispute of this kind?
Well, the broad losses imply that the costs of production, the breaking of the chains of production will affect their costs overall and their efficiency. Now, the case of Brazil is particular in the sense that Brazil is a fairly closed economy, much more closed than other economies in South America. So in a sense, being closed already affects them in a smaller way. So they have less to lose, which is the opposite of very open countries like Mexico, which have far more to lose.
Robert, the United States has generally supported free trade, especially after the Second World War. In fact, this country played a key role in writing the rules of free trade around the world. But when we look at these protectionist measures, how will it affect the main trading partners of the United States? Because the conventional view has always been that if your trading partners are prospering, then you get rich as well.
No, this is, at least in my opinion, one of the more frustrating things about this. It appears that America is having a short attention span and a short memory. At the end of World War II, both parties supported a globalization of free trade agenda with the idea that a prosperous trading world would be a less warlike world, and also with the goal of bringing allies together and integrating with them economically. And there was enormous success. People forget that, you know, a little longer than a generation ago, South Korea was an extremely poor country, around the GDP per capita of Ghana, and it's exploded. And it didn't happen by accident, right? It happened because of globalization and free trade. And the whole strategy for America was to build up our allies and friends around the world with trade. We appear to be, or at least part of the American political system appears to be reverting to what it looked like in America in the 1890s, where you had the Republican Party as the protectionist party. I'm not sure that works as well in a globally integrated worldwide economy today. I think that's possibly very difficult to defend. We have plenty of data around the world, not only showing that free trade has helped pull people out of poverty and pull countries out of poverty. We also have opinion data showing that globalization, especially in emerging market countries, is actually more popular than it is in more advanced economies around the world. So emerging markets do understand that this actually is a net benefit to them. So this is a very complicated situation right now. My concern is that the political feedback loop, we might take the wrong lessons from this. And sort of mislearn some of the things that we should be learning in the U.S.
Right, talking about politics, Robert, what is the impact inside the United States? I mean, politicians like Donald Trump, they always have an eye to elections and politics in the country.
Right. Yeah. And my background is in political polling. So the challenge here, I think, is that net, these trade actions are marginally unpopular right now. They may grow to be even more unpopular as some of the costs bite, and I'm not sure they exactly are. We see some data that just came out from the Atlanta Fed that suggests that U.S. businesses, at least in the Atlanta Fed region, are reconsidering some of their investment because of this. That's interesting. But right now, U.S. public opinion is split, but just marginally negative towards it. So 41% think that Trump's trade policies are a change for the better. 42% say they're a change for the worse. 49% say that increasing tariffs is bad for the country. 40% think it's good for the country. This is the problem of hyper-partisanship with almost anything at this point in time. With all that said, the support for U.S. farmers is actually, there's a majority support for U.S. farmers in existing polling. The challenge for the Trump coalition, or the Trump folks, is that on one hand, it's net unpopular for them in the United States. On the other hand, in some of the states they need to win re-election in the Electoral College, it could be popular. We don't know. Some of the agricultural red states, this could end up being unpopular and then hurting them. But this could be popular in Pennsylvania and Illinois and Wisconsin, et cetera. So the political calculus of this gets very complex very quickly.
Arthur, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, he addressed the trade war at the recent BRICS summit in Johannesburg. This is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
A trade war should be rejected because there will be no winner. Economic hegemony is even more objectionable because it will undermine the collective interest of the international community. Those who pursue this cause will only hurt themselves.
So here we hear that statement there. Of course, he's targeting, it's directed at the United States, but China has pretty well established trade relations with countries of Africa, with the countries of Latin America. How is that relationship going to be affected?
Well, certainly with Latin America, with Africa, China has become the #1 trade partner in these very, very large economies. And so what we will see, particularly with these resource-based economies, Brazil, Africa, Chile, they've been highly reliant and dependent on Chinese imports. In other words, China importing those mineral and raw materials for the conversion into building materials and et cetera. And so if China slows down with regard to its economic path of economic advancement, Africa and many countries, the large countries in Latin America, will most certainly feel the impact as well.
Okay, we need to take a break right now. More of our conversation about the US-China trade conflict and its impact on developing economies. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.